I'm Danny Dorling. I'm a professor of geography at the University of Oxford, and I've just published a book called Slow Down, the End of the Great Acceleration. I wanted to talk about slowdown and the pandemic. The book I've been working on for 6 years was published just as the pandemic was at its height. But the final changes to the book were made before we even knew there was going to be a pandemic at all. However, I do talk about pandemics in the book. In particular, I have a section on the 1918 pandemic, which was enormous, although estimates vary dramatically. People often say it killed 50 million people, but the best estimates are about 17.5 million people. We always tend to overestimate how many people die in a pandemic at the beginning of a pandemic. That pandemic in 1918, 1919 was associated with a 14% fall in GDP globally. And of course, there was a war in Europe at the same time and a revolution in Russia. But a 14% fall looked devastating. However, the year after 1919, world GDP rose by 16%. It was a blip. It could not really be seen in terms of economic progress. It was almost as if it had never happened. Now that may sound strange to you, but we can go forward and we can look at other pandemics because we've had a few. And the other pandemics that we've had in the world, we often forget that we've had them. The big flu pandemics, 1951, a terrible flu pandemic, far greater mortality worldwide than this, despite the fact that the planet had a much lower human population and despite the fact there were far fewer older people back then. The 1951 pandemic, you won't remember it, and it didn't dent the recovery from the Second World War at all. The 1968-69 flu pandemic. A million people died in the United States due to the 1968-69 flu pandemic. The effect on world economy, the effect on trade, nothing. And it came back. This is why we worry about second waves. It came back in 1970 and it came back in 1972. Again, didn't matter because we were on an acceleration. We've had other pandemics that I won't talk about. TB now, AIDS, very different, but far more people die of AIDS now than will die of this. And then, of course, we've had the pandemics, the scare ones, the ones that we thought might be big but weren't. Swine flu, SARS originally. Okay, and maybe we became a bit complacent. You can let us off a little bit because it's been over 50 years since there's been a sharp up and down pandemic of this kind. I was looking at world GDP in this slowdown book. And what I noticed is that GDP rose faster in the 50s than the 60s, faster in the 60s than the 70s, faster in the 70s than the 80s, faster in the 80s than the 90s, and so on and on. Economic growth has been slowing since the 1950s. So I then decided to look at other things. I thought, well, let's look at the rate of innovation. Let's see, are we inventing fewer things? This is very debatable, but the rate of innovation, many people who study it claim, was fastest in the 1930s. Why? Because there were more things to be found in the 1930s. Electricity was still relatively new. I'm talking to you over a video screen. I had that in 1990. That is a long time ago. The rate of innovation has been dropping. I'm now living through the 5th artificial intelligence revolution of my lifetime. The biggest thing of all, certainly in terms of economics, is the decline in the rate of the growth of markets. And the basic element of a market is people. The year of greatest acceleration in the number of people in the planet, 1968, when that flu pandemic hit. World population was growing by 2% a year. Currently, it's around about 1% and falling, down from 2 to 1. The UN predicts, and many people think they're too cautious, the UN predicts that within the lifetime of young children today, that will hit 0%. That's world stability. Here are the 4 things which were still accelerating, at least accelerating in January of 2020. University graduates worldwide, particularly international university graduates. they were still rising and rising faster than the year before as a proportion of all young people in the world. The next was air flights. I think we were about 4 billion, over 4 billion flights a year, passengers. These aren't 4 billion separate people. I'm afraid a few of us are very guilty. Anyway, the number of flights in the world wasn't just going up, it was going up exponentially. Now, for the moment, that of course has ended. After that, our overall consumption, despite the fact that our population numbers were falling, despite the fact our GDP wasn't rising as fast, somehow we were managing to carry on consuming goods, particularly goods that contain carbon, at an ever increasing rate. So our carbon pollution as a result of our consumption was doubling every 22 years. The last time I measured it, that had slowed to a doubling every 23 years. That's absolutely terrible. That's something that really needs to slow down. And it lags those other things. Our carbon consumption, our consumption of material goods lags the decline in innovation, the decline in GDP, and the decline in our numbers. And finally, the final thing that was slowing was average surface temperature of the planet, which was not just rising, but rising slightly faster than the year before. However, when NASA measured it in February this year, it was a tenth of a degree below February the year before. This is the time when the most massive drop in carbon pollution ever has occurred because China was no longer producing. Things are going to bounce back. A lot of things will bounce back. Sadly, carbon pollution will probably bounce back quite quickly. But some things won't. Some things will change forever. We know we don't need to fly as much as we did before. We know we can talk like this. But the amount of time that I have gained by not traveling anywhere in the last few weeks has been enough to cope with all the extra administrative load of being a university professor dealing with hundreds of panicking students. So, you know, you gain time as well as lose experiences. Slow down the end of the Great Acceleration. It was slowing down before the pandemic. We have a terrible tendency to think that what is happening right now is the most important thing. We are a myopic species. We just concentrate on ourselves, on us, and what's happening around us. So when we had this great slowdown in GDP over 60 or 70 years, we kept on looking at oil shocks, recessions, crashes, and blaming it on them rather than stepping back and saying, actually, this thing is slowing down anyway. My argument to you is that we have to accept that a slowdown is underway, and you don't necessarily have to think it is a bad thing, because the alternative, ever increasing acceleration, really would have been utterly impossible. Thank you very much.